Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classic Lectures. We are now in lecture number 99. We are in the Harvard Classics volume number 28, Essays, English and American, and the volume finishes, one of its final essays is Thoreau's classic essay, Walking. Now this one is sometimes called The Wild for reasons that we will get into. It is a lecture that Thoreau first gave at the Concord Lyceum. The 23rd of April, 1851. Now, think about that date in terms of, for example, Leaves of Grass of 1855, Song of the Open Road of Whitman's in 1856. In many ways, this will be one of the most important documents that Thoreau will ever have penned. He actually read this piece 10 different times in his life, scholars believe, and more than any other of the other lectures that he gave, this was maybe the one that he was most pleased with. After he died, it was first published as an essay in the Atlantic Monthly in 1862. Now, we have, of course, covered a lot of territory in regards to, on LearnStrong.net, in regards to Emerson. Think about that. The Harvard Classics lectures from 35 to 55. Those 20 lectures are just our celebration of Emerson. And in many ways, I'm going to assume, as this the 99th lecture, and there's something right about this being the lecture right before the 100th lecture of the Harvard Classics, that it would be devoted to Thoreau and to this classic essay, Walking. I've also given lectures on transcendentalism and, of course, Plato's theory of the forms. You can find this as well at LearnStrong.net. And, of course, I've given already some lectures on Thoreau's Walden and civil disobedience. I am imagining, though, that this lecture is in some ways the introductory lecture to a series of distinct lectures over each of the 18 chapters of Walden, and that will follow in the Harvard Classics, this lecture. In many ways, this lecture is, how should one say, the gateway drug, if you will, to Walden. I mean, if you really appreciate what Thoreau is arguing in Walden, you will want to pick up, what Thoreau is arguing in Walking, you will want to pick up his text, Walden, and study it with more clarity. But where to begin? I think, even though I've given all those lectures by Emerson earlier in the Harvard Classics, there was one lecture that I saved, and it is his tribute lecture to Thoreau himself. I'm going to turn just for a few minutes to that lecture. And even though I've already given biography on Thoreau, any number of other places, I just want to hear what Emerson has to say about his pal Thoreau from this famous essay that was written, of course, after Thoreau's passing. We're told, of course, about his dates early on, born on the 12th of July, 1817. He graduates from Harvard College at 1837. Emerson wants to point out very early, we're 10 lines into his essay, and he calls him an iconoclast. And in that regards, already we're going to put him into tradition in 303. Of course, Thoreau is one of our really important thinkers because of his iconoclastic tendencies. Remember, we like to change the word from iconoclast to iconoblastic. That is to say, he blasts the kind of sacred traditions and understandings. We immediately think of Chaucer when we mention him, and Chaucer will get mentioned actually by Thoreau in the classic essay Walking. Of course, think of it, Thoreau, a great walker, we're going to hear about this from Emerson, but think about how many classic texts we've studied in 303 that are tributes to walking. Dante's Divine Comedy immediately, obviously, comes to mind, as does Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, of which we've given a lecture in the Harvard Classics. Back to Thoreau. He was incurious, Thoreau will say, of technical and textual science. He was, we're told, a man who was competent to live in any part of the world. It would cost him less time to supply his wants than another. He was therefore secure of his leisure. He did spend some time as a land surveyor, and we're going to hear some of that in the essay Walking. Right? We're told that he, although never went to church, he never voted. He refused to pay tax to the state. That is to say, he would not pay taxes for a government that he did not believe was correct, especially as it related to his views, his pacifism, as well as, of course, his views on abolition. He ate no flesh, he drank no wine, he never knew the use of tobacco, and though a naturalist, he used neither trap nor gun. He chose wisely no doubt, for himself to be the bachelor of thought and nature. He had no talent for wealth and knew how to be poor without the least hint of squalor or inelegance. We're told by Emerson that he declined invitations to dinner parties because each was in everyone's way, and he couldn't meet the individuals to any purpose. This has led, of course, to this myth that Thoreau was, kind of like a person who was not very gregarious, didn't like to hang out with people, which is a complete myth. We're going to see this in his comments in Walking, as well as in his comments in Walden, right? When asked at the table what dish he preferred, he answered the nearest, which is, of course, a classic answer, right? And then finally, we get to where we really need to be with Emerson's view of Thoreau. He chose to be rich by making his wants few and supplying them himself. In his travels, he used the railroad only to get over so much country as was unimportant to the present purpose, walking hundreds of miles, avoiding taverns, buying a lodging in farmers' and fishermen's houses is cheaper and more agreeable to him. In other words, he was a great walker. Yet, hermit and stoic as he was really fond of sympathy and threw himself heartily and childlike into the company of younger people whom he loved and whom he delighted to entertain. And then, of course, we're told that in 1845 he built himself a small framed house on the shores of Walden, where he lived for those 2 years, those famous 2 years, right? Emerson says about Thoreau, he coldly and fully stated his opinion without affecting to believe that it was the opinion of the company. In other words, sometimes epistemologically Thoreau will take the absolutist position, but most of the time he, of course, was a fallibilist, and we of course, will use Thoreau in many ways as an exemplar. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong epistemologically. He was a great lover of books, we're told, and we're told as well, no truer American existed than Thoreau. He was a great lover of country, but of course, he was a great critiquer of country as well. To continue and to just finish what Thoreau, or what Emerson has to say, we're told again, he said he could outwalk most countrymen in a day's journey, and the relation of body and mind was still finer than we have indicated. He said he wanted every stride his legs made. The length of his walk uniformly made the length of his writing. If shut up in the house, he did not write at all. We're going to hear this sentiment echoed in the classic essay of Walking, right? We're told that he lived for the day, not cumbered and mortified by his memory. If he bought you yesterday a new proposition, he would bring you today another, not less revolutionary. A very industrious man, and setting, like all highly organized men, a high value on his time. This is central to understanding energy conservation model, as we'll talk about it when we mess around with Walden. He seemed the only man of leisure in town, always ready for any excursion that promised well, or for conversation prolonged into late hours. He loved to walk and to talk, and Thoreau and Emerson did that often. He was very much interested in the simple and the hidden life, is the way Thoreau says it. The idea of the journaling and the writing, we're told it was a pleasure and a privilege to walk with him. He knew the country like a fox or a bird and passed through it as freely by paths of his own. He knew every track in the snow or on the ground and what creature had taken his path before him. One must submit abjectly to such a guide, and the reward was great. Under his arm, he carried an old music book to press plants. In his pocket, his diary and pencil, a spyglass for birds, microscope, jackknife, and twine. He wore straw hat, stout shoes, strong gray trousers to brave shrub oaks and smellicks, and to climb a tree for a hawk's or a squirrel's nest. Well, it seems to me that as we look at Emerson's view of Thoreau, we want to turn to the essay Walking. It is his energy, it is his curiosity that Emerson will address. let's turn now specifically to this essay, Walking. And let's discover some key lines, and let's pay attention to the way that we will study Thoreau now, not only in this essay, but in our comments about Walden to follow, in our addressing of each of the individual chapters of Walden. Our Big Five. That is to say, our reading theory says we're always learning new information, the ability to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. Of course, we're always asking ourselves three guiding questions as we read a text. What does the text say? Level 1. What does the text mean? Level 2. At 2A, themes, messages. At 2B, rhetoric. Not what he says, but how he says it. I think it's fascinating that Emerson points out that Thoreau had this really long gait, and his lines will somehow mirror that. That's a beautiful kind of 2B observation. And finally, at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? We of course say that we are the stories we tell and retell, the stories we accept, and of course to think of Thoreau, the stories we reject. We call them an iconoclast. But I think it's really important that we recognize that today we still need to pick up a writer like Thoreau, and enjoy him, and be challenged by him. If Emerson says he was the true American, and I think that that's only half true, I think we've got to marry in some way Thoreau with Whitman to really understand what America is, especially during this special time in American history, that transcendental period, as we sometimes call it. Then we've got to ask ourselves how we relate to this information in some meaningful way. And so at level 3, that's kind of what we ask. At 3A, how does this relate to other titles? Notice I've already mentioned Chaucer, I've mentioned Dante, I've mentioned Bunyan. I mean, the list will go on and on when we start to make our connections, because Thoreau was so amazingly well read, not just in the natural sciences, but as well in religion and in theology and of course in literature. I mean, he took a copy of the Bhagavad Gita with him to Walden Pond. There's so much to be said about that, and I think Thoreau for us is someone that we need to pay attention to, again, as we move now and live now in 200 plus years since his time. Finally, we'll ask the most important question, and it's the question that Thoreau will in fact energize us to ask right here in this essay, Walking, and that is, how can I relate personally to some of this information? Not that I necessarily have to agree with everything that Thoreau is saying, we probably won't, but there's a challenge to be laid down, I think, for us, and intellectually we want to pay attention to that. More than talking about Thoreau, and since this is an essay that was first a lecture, I think it makes more sense for me to read it. Now, some of you are smiling because you know that if I had my rathers, I'd read the whole thing, all hour and a half of it for you out loud, but alas, I don't have the time. So I'm going to turn now, after these brief comment words, and I just want to enjoy Thoreau's language. As we have said many times in 303, if you want to be a fine writer, then you need to read good writing. And of course, Thoreau's style, I mean, it obviously is a little bit arcane today. We like things to be a little bit more directed to the point. And yet, I'm going to make the argument that the more you read Thoreau, the more you realize that his style is one that probably should be rediscovered again. How did the lines open? He says it this way. I wish to speak a word for nature. Notice it is capitalized. For absolute freedom and wildness, as contrasted with a freedom in culture merely civil. To regard man, and of course, back to the old ways, man here meaning human, right, as an inhabitant or a part and parcel of nature rather than a member of society. I wish to make an extreme statement. If so, I may make an emphatic one, for there are enough champions of civilization, the minister and the school community, and every one of you will take care of that. Now, of course, let's remind ourselves, as we introduce ourselves to Thoreau, and to our study here, and as well Walden to follow, we're obviously concentrating on our Big Five. That is to say, what is this text and what does Thoreau suggest about epistemology, what you can know? That is to say, the absolutist position, I'm right and you're wrong, or the relativist position, there is no truth. Thoreau is a great fan of pointing out, if you say there is no truth, you've posited a truth, which leads us, as it led Thoreau, to the fallibilist position, right? That is to say, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. That notion that I think I'm right, but I could be wrong is, of course, for Thoreau, sacred, right? Epistemologically. Number 2 of our Big Five, ontologically. That is to say, who are you? Thoreau was very interested in a question like this, and obviously, he's going to challenge us to do the same. So we'll ask, who are we? And notice, Already we've seen some of this. We are a species that somehow walks between two things. That is to say, Scylla and Charybdis, back to our Homer and the Odyssey. That is to say, on the one hand, we love nature, the wild. On the other hand, civilization, and the fact that there has to be some sense of civilization for us to be able to thrive at all. Thoreau is a great advocate for critiquing both roles, ontologically speaking. Number 3, of course, is psychology, the individual mind. And what is this text and what does Thoreau believe about psychology? And more interestingly, the motivations that lead us to act. We act, yes, but why? That's the questions of psychology. Of course, sociology, the 4th of our big 5, not just individual psychology, but the group. How does the group understand the dynamics that happen? And when is it the case that it's best for me to be an individual outside of society? And when, of course, is it the case for me to be included in society? I mean, it was Thoreau that pointed out, these obviously are symbiotic. That is to say, there is no your life because two people, as we often say, two people had to hook up and exchange fluids to produce you. And therefore, it's never been your life. It's always been our life. And yet, we're going to hear this in walking. There's an interesting tension. At what point, though, do I have to make my own choices outside of the sociological community? And of course, that tension is going to be hypercritical. Finally, our big 5, and it's a huge one for Thoreau. I mean, in many ways, Thoreau is the reason why we so often talk about the question of theodicy. Yes, of course, Thoreau knew his Milton, and he knew Paradise Lost, so he understood the questions of theodicy. Why do bad things have to happen in this world? Why do we have to have pain? Why do we have to have suffering? Of course, it will be Thoreau that teaches us that when bad things happen, you can't ask, why did this happen to me? You have to learn how to ask, why did this happen for me? That is to say, Thoreau will not allow us to think of ourselves as somehow a victim in the universe that's constantly doing nasties to us. So notice right away, he's going to begin with this discussion of wildness in nature versus society. I have met, to continue just the opening lines, I have met with but 1 or 2 persons in the course of my life who understood the art of walking, that is, of taking walks, who had a genius, so to speak, for sauntering, which word is beautifully derived from idle people who roved about the country in the Middle Ages and asked charity under the pretense of going à la Sauntering to the Holy Land, till the children exclaimed, there goes a saunturier, or a saunter, a Holy Lander. They who never go to the Holy Land in their walks, as they pretend, are indeed mere idlers and vagabonds. But they who do go there are saunters in the good sense such as I mean. Now, of course, here already we have the beauty of the metaphor. And we can't, I mean, we mentioned it already, Whitman's Song of the Open Road. Maybe, is it the most important text in 303? I don't know. Who's to say? I mean, a number of students have said, yeah, you can't have 303 without Whitman's Song of the Open Road. I would argue you can't have Whitman's Song of the Open Road without an essay called Walking. Clearly, that essay very much influenced Whitman, and I think it is the case, set in many ways this notion of the American journey as the walk, right? The walk. And I've said it many times. I think one of the most important things we can do as students is to get out of our vehicles and go for walks. If you have to take your vehicle somewhere where it's nice and lonely, solitude is great for walks, right? Then do it. But then get out, go for the walk, enjoy the experience of walking. Well, let's hear what Thoreau has to say about walking. And now I'm going to begin to just skip through the essay and enjoy a few of the most powerful lines. He says it this way. We have felt that we almost alone hereabouts practice this noble art, though to tell the truth, at least if their own assertions are to be received, most of my townsmen would fain walk sometimes, as I do, but they cannot. No wealth can buy the requisite leisure, freedom, and independence, which are the capital in this profession. It comes only by the grace of God. It requires a direct dispensation from heaven to become a walker. Here, of course, we've got Thoreau messing around with St. Augustine and the whole notion of grace, and he does that beautifully, doesn't he, right? He says, I think that I cannot preserve my health and spirits unless I spend 4 hours a day at least, and it's commonly more than that, sauntering through the woods and over the hills and fields, absolutely free from all worldly engagements. He says it a few lines later, no doubt temperament and above all age have a good deal to do with it. As a man grows older, His ability to sit still and follow indoor occupations increases. He grows vesperantal in his habits as the evening of life approaches, till at last he comes forth only just before sundown and gets all the walk that he requires in half an hour. It's of course a beautiful idea, right? That if you want to think about your life as a long walk, then the older you get, the less you want to walk, the more you want to kind of sit down, and entropy starts to take over. In other words, Thoreau is always waking us up to that notion, and we're going to hear this in our lines in Walden. We must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn that does not forsake us in our darkest hours, right? He will say there, I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of a man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor. Well, for Thoreau, walking is that conscious endeavor, and it becomes not just a literal, but a metaphoric, figurative activity. He continues, but the walking of which I speak has nothing in akin to taking exercise, as it's called, as the sick take medicine at stated hours, as the swinging of dumbbells or chairs. I love that. Next time you drive past a Gold's Gym or whatever, think about that, the swinging of dumbbells or chairs. But is itself the enterprise and adventure of the day. If you would get exercise, go in search of the springs of life. I mean, we have these lines through Walden. We're going to have them here. Think of a man swinging dumbbells for his health when those springs are bubbling up in a far-off pastures unsought by him, and then you have the exclamation point. Few essays have as many exclamation points, and I think Thoreau meant to do it. He probably was giving himself markers as to when he got ready to read this or to present this lecture. He wanted to make sure that he had the proper energy, something obviously he spends a lot of time with, right? And then he says, moreover, you must walk like a camel, which is said to be the only beast which ruminates when walking. When a traveler asked Wordsworth's servant to show him her master's study, she answered, here is his library, but his study is out of doors. Now, obviously, we love Tintern Abbey so much that we've given lectures on all these titles I'm referencing, obviously, but we want to pay attention to the ways in which Thoreau is playing the same game that Wordsworth would play as a great walker, as a lover of walking. And of course, in Tintern Abbey, it's there, so I dare to hope, right? No change, no doubt from what I was. Some, he says, do not walk at all.